The first thing Gideon Mercer saw was not blood. It was shame. A young woman lay twisted on the sunburned grass near the Smoky Hill River. Her wrists were bound tight behind her back with rough hemp rope, the kind of rope you use to tie down cargo on a wagon. Her ankles were pulled together and bent backward. Her torn white dress clung to her skin like it had given up trying to protect her from the world. The Kansas heat pressed down on everything like a heavy wool blanket. The sun was merciless, unforgiving. It beat down on the dry grass and made the air shimmer like water on a hot skillet. The wind lifted the fabric of her dress just enough to steal what little dignity she had left. Gideon froze where he stood. His horse stopped behind him, sensing something was wrong. 48 years on the plains had shown him death in all its ugly forms. He had seen hunger that hollowed men out like empty barrels, made them look like walking skeletons with skins stretched too tight over bone. He had watched cowboys torn apart by cattle stampedes, seen men shot down in gunfights over cards and whiskey, and women who were not worth dying for. He had buried friends in shallow graves and said prayers over strangers who died alone on the trail with nobody to remember their names. But this was different. This was a woman left alive on purpose, posed like a warning sign on a fence post, abandoned in broad daylight where anyone riding by could see her, where anyone could find her exactly like this. Someone wanted her found. Someone had taken their time with her, had tied those knots careful and slow, had arranged her just so, like they were setting a trap and she was the bait. The woman saw him then. Her eyes went wide with terror, pure animal fear, the kind of fear that makes your heart pound so hard you think it might burst right out of your chest. Then her eyes squeezed shut, squeezed so tight the wrinkles spread across her face, like the world itself had become too much to bear. Like if she could not see him, then maybe he was not really there. Her voice came out broken and uneven, barely more than a whisper carried on the hot wind. "Do not look. Please do not look there." The words were weak, embarrassed, pleading, not a cry for help, not a scream for rescue, just a desperate plea for mercy, a prayer to whatever God might be listening that this stranger would turn around and ride away. Pretend he never saw her. Let her keep whatever tiny scrap of dignity she had left. Gideon felt his chest lock up tight, like someone had wrapped iron bands around his ribs and was squeezing until he could barely breathe. He did not know where to look, so he looked nowhere at all. He stared at the horizon, at the brown grass meeting the blue sky in a wavering line. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. His hands shook like he was a boy of 12 caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The woman shifted slightly on the ground, trying to curl in on herself, trying to hide. But the ropes bit into her skin, and the movement made her gasp in pain, a sharp sound that cut through the hot air like a knife. It was clear now that she had been stripped of more than her belongings. Whatever modest undergarments she once wore had been taken. She was exposed in a way no decent person would ever choose, left like that on purpose. So whoever found her would see exactly what they wanted him to see. Gideon understood then, understood with a cold certainty that settled in his gut like a stone. This was a message, and he was meant to receive it. He pulled the wool blanket from his saddle, a rough gray thing he used on cold nights when he was sleeping out on the range. He tossed it toward her without looking back, without turning around, without letting his eyes go anywhere they should not go. "Do not move." His voice cracked despite himself, cracked like a dry riverbed in summer. "Just stay still." The blanket landed over her legs, covered what needed covering. She let out a breath that sounded like relief mixed with sobbing, like a dam breaking somewhere deep inside her. Dust clung to her cheeks in streaks. Tears cut pale lines through the dirt on her face. She tried to curl inward again, tried to pull the blanket tighter, but the rope stopped her short. The silence between them was heavy, thick as molasses. Only the sound of grasshoppers filled the hot summer air, the distant stamp of Gideon's horse pawing at the dry ground, a hawk circling somewhere overhead, calling out in that lonesome way hawks do. This was no accident. No storm had done this to her. No wild animal. Someone had taken their time. Someone had meant for her to be found exactly like this, tied up and shamed and left in the sun to suffer. The question burned in Gideon's mind like a hot coal. If she was left here alive, ashamed, terrified. Then what kind of man was supposed to find her? And what was supposed to happen next? He had been riding fence lines all morning, checking for breaks in the wire where cattle might wander off, looking for strays that might have drifted during the night. His ranch spread across 3,000 acres of Kansas prairie. Good land, hard land. The kind of land that tested men and broke the ones who were not strong enough to stand up to it. Gideon had built the Mercer Ranch with his own two hands. He had been 23 years old when he drove his first herd across the territory, a young man full of dreams and determination. Back then his hair was dark as coal, and his back never ached in the morning. His eyes were sharp enough to spot a coyote at 1,000 yards. His hands were quick enough to draw and fire before most men could blink. Now his hair had gone silver at the temples, gray creeping in like frost on a window pane. His knees complained when he climbed down from the saddle. His shoulders ached when the weather changed, but his eyes were still sharp enough. His hands were still steady enough, and his heart still knew right from wrong. Finding this woman changed everything. As Gideon finally knelt down to cut the ropes at her ankles, his mind was already working through the possibilities. Who would do something like this? And why would they do it here, on land that bordered his property? Close enough that he was sure to find her on his morning rounds. Too close to be coincidence. The woman's voice trembled again, smaller this time, more desperate. Please do not look. I cannot bear it. Please. Gideon nodded even though she could not see it. He kept his eyes fixed on the far hills, on the brown grass waving in the wind, on anything and everything except the woman lying on the ground in front of him. Ma'am, I'm going to cut these ropes. I will not look. You have my word on that. And my word means something out here. She swallowed hard under the blanket. Her breathing was ragged, uneven, like someone trying not to fall apart completely, like someone holding on to sanity by the thinnest of threads. I did not mean for anyone to see me like this. Her voice was barely a whisper. I did not want this. Then she let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but it was a laugh that hurt, a laugh that had broken glass in it. Guess that ship sailed a long time ago. She was trying to joke, trying to hold herself together with humor because it was the only thing she had left, the only weapon she had against the shame and the fear and the pain. Gideon understood that. He had done the same thing plenty of times in his life. When the world got too heavy, when the pain got too deep, when everything seemed hopeless and dark. Sometimes a bad joke was the only rope you had to hold on to. He reached behind him and grabbed his canteen, still facing away, still careful. He held it out like a man offering peace. Take a small sip. Do not choke on it. Her hand trembled as it found the canteen. She drank, a small sip like he told her, then coughed, then gave a tiny angry sigh, warm as bathwater. Gideon almost smiled despite everything. Welcome to Kansas. It does that every summer. Gets so hot you could fry an egg on a fence post. That little bit of normal talk did something important. It made her feel human again. Not just a poor, broken thing left on the grass like discarded trash. Her breathing slowed a little. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. The blanket stayed tight around her like it was the last good thing in the world. I am Mabel. Her voice was steadier now, still shaky but steadier. Most folks call me May. Gideon nodded at the horizon. Gideon. Friends call me Gid. You can call me whatever gets you through the next 5 minutes. She almost laughed again, a real laugh this time. Small but real. Then she winced as the movement pulled at her bonds. The ropes had dug deep into her wrists. The skin looked raw and swollen. Angry red marks circled her arms like bracelets made of pain. Gideon felt that old familiar anger rise up inside him. The kind that starts deep in your gut and climbs slow and hot to your throat. The kind that makes your hands want to curl into fists. The kind that makes good men do hard things. Somebody did this on purpose. Somebody tied those knots like they had plenty of time, like they enjoyed every single second of it. And now Gideon was going to find out who. But first he had to get this woman somewhere safe, somewhere out of the sun, somewhere she could breathe without fear. He had no idea that his whole life was about to change, that this woman would lead him straight into a betrayal he never saw coming, that before the week was over, he would lose everything he thought he knew about loyalty and friendship and trust. But right now, in this moment, all that mattered was cutting those ropes. So let me ask you something before we go any further. If you found someone like this, hurt, ashamed, left behind like they were nothing, would you stop to help them, or would you run on by and pretend you never saw a thing? Think about that while we continue with the story. May spoke like every word cost her something precious, like she was paying in blood for each syllable that left her lips. They took my bag, my shoes, and what little modesty I had left, just to be cruel, just because they could. Gideon's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He still did not look at her directly, still kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. He reached back and found a second strip of cloth from his saddle roll, an old bandana he used to wipe sweat from his face on hot days. He slid it toward her across the grass. Wrap that around your shoulders. There is no honor in the wind getting a better view than it deserves. May pulled the cloth around herself. For just a second, she sounded almost like a regular young woman. Someone you might meet at a church social. Someone you might dance with at a barn raising. Someone with a whole life ahead of her instead of whatever nightmare she had just survived. If you tell anyone you saw me like this, she said, her voice trying for lightness but not quite making it, I will haunt your barn. I will rattle every bucket you own until you go mad from the noise. Gideon huffed softly, a sound that was almost a laugh. Ma'am, if you can haunt, then you do not need my help getting revenge. But I would appreciate you haunting the men who did this to you first. They deserve it more than my buckets do. She went quiet again. The joke had run its course. Reality was settling back in like dust after a storm, heavy and thick and impossible to ignore. Then she whispered something that made Gideon's blood run cold in his veins. I was headed for a beanie. The depot there. I worked the desk sometimes, filing papers, keeping records. They said I heard something I should not have heard. Gideon's eyes narrowed at that. His mind started turning like gears in a mill. A beanie was not just cattle and whiskey. It was gossip and money and secrets. The kind of town where information changed hands like poker chips, where the wrong word in the wrong ear could get you killed, or worse, where men smiled at you over breakfast and plotted your murder over dinner. He had been to Abene plenty of times, knew the streets, knew the saloons, knew which men could be trusted and which would sell their own mothers for $1 and a drink. But he did not know what kind of trouble was brewing there now. What kind of trouble had reached out and grabbed this woman and left her here like bait in a trap. He shifted his weight and finally lowered himself to one knee, still looking away, still careful not to let his eyes wander where they should not go. All right, May, I'm going to finish cutting these ropes. Then we get you out of this sun before you burn up worse than you already have. And then you are going to tell me everything you heard at that depot, every word, every name, every detail you can remember. May nodded slowly. Her voice came out steadier now, stronger, like telling her story was giving her back some of the strength that had been stolen from her. Okay, Gideon worked the knife against the rope at her ankles. The fibers were thick and coarse, the kind of rope you use for tying down heavy cargo. Not the kind you find lying around by accident. Someone had planned this, had brought this rope special, had thought about every detail. As the last strand gave way, May pulled her legs in close to her body. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself like armor, like it could protect her from whatever was still out there waiting. Thank you. The words came out soft, not loud, not dramatic, just real, just honest. Just a woman grateful to a stranger for treating her like a human being. Gideon stood and dusted off his knees. His joints popped and cracked, reminding him that he was not as young as he used to be. Can you walk? May tried to stand. Her legs wobbled like a newborn calf taking its first steps. She grabbed at the tall grass and nearly fell face first into the dirt. Gideon caught her arm without thinking. His hand was rough from decades of ranch work, calloused and strong from years of roping and riding and building fences. But his grip was gentle, careful not to hurt her any more than she had already been hurt. Easy now, take your time. We have got all day if we need it. May looked up at him then, really looked at him for the first time since he had found her. She saw a man with silver at his temples and sun-weathered skin, a man with kind eyes the color of a winter sky, a man with a jaw set hard against the cruelty of the world. Why are you helping me? She asked. The question seemed to surprise even her. like she did not understand why anyone would bother. You do not even know me. You do not know who I am or what I did or why this happened. For all you know, I deserved it. Gideon considered the question. He could have said a lot of things. He could have talked about duty, about the code of the West, about how a real man treats women and strangers and people who need help. But instead, he just shrugged, because somebody should help you. And I happen to be standing here. Sometimes that is all the reason you need. May stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something, looking for the trick, the catch, the hidden motive that surely must be there. She did not find it, because it was not there. Something shifted in her eyes then. The fear was still there. The shame was still there. The pain and the trauma and the memory of what had been done to her. All of that was still there and would be there for a long time to come. But now there was something else too. Hope. Maybe just a tiny spark of it. A small flame flickering in the darkness. But it was there. And sometimes a small flame is all you need to light your way home. Gideon helped her walk toward his horse, a big chestnut gelding named Copper, who had been his companion for nearly 15 years. The horse was calm and steady, old enough to be wise, but not so old that he could not run when running was needed. Copper snorted softly as they approached. His ears swiveled forward like he was trying to figure out what was going on. He studied May with those big brown horse eyes, taking her measure, deciding if she was friend or trouble. "This is Copper," Gideon said. "He does not bite, much, only when someone tries to steal his oats." May reached out a trembling hand and touched the horse's nose. Her fingers were shaking. Her whole arm was shaking. But she made herself do it anyway. Made herself reach out and connect with something amiable and warm and gentle. Copper leaned into her palm like he understood, like he could sense what she had been through, like he was trying to comfort her in the only way a horse knows how. "He is beautiful," May whispered. Gideon nodded. "He is also stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery when he wants to be. But he has never let me down when it mattered. Not once in 15 years. He helped May climb up into the saddle. She was still wrapped in the blanket, still pale as milk, still shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. But she held on tight and did not complain, did not ask for anything more than what she had already been given. Gideon took the reins and started walking, leading Copper along the riverbank, away from the spot where May had been left like discarded trash, away from the memory of what had happened there. "Where are we going?" May asked. Her voice was small, tired. "My place. It is about 3 miles from here. You can rest there, get some real clothes that actually fit you, get some food in your belly, and then we figure out what to do next." May was quiet for a while. The only sounds were the creak of leather and the steady clop of Copper's hooves on the hard-packed ground. The wind whispered through the tall grass like it was sharing secrets. Then she spoke again. "Gideon, yeah, there is something else you need to know. Something important." Gideon kept walking. His boots crunched on the dry grass. The sun beat down on his shoulders like a heavy hand pressing him into the earth. "What is it?" May's voice dropped low, almost a whisper, like she was afraid someone might be listening even out here in the middle of nowhere. "The men who did this to me, they were not strangers. They were not drifters or outlaws from somewhere far away. They were not bandits looking for easy money." Gideon felt a cold knot form in his stomach, a feeling like something bad was coming, something he could not stop. "What do you mean?" May swallowed hard. Her next words came out slow and careful, like she was picking her way through a field full of broken glass. "I saw one of them before. Not today, not out on the prairie. Somewhere else." Her voice dropped even lower. "I saw him at your ranch, wearing your brand, eating at your table." Gideon stopped walking. His heart was pounding in his chest. His mind was racing through names and faces, trying to figure out who she could be talking about, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. One of his own men, someone who worked for him, someone he fed and paid and trusted with his livelihood. May continued in that same trembling whisper, her words falling like stones into still water. "He was giving the orders, telling the others what to do, where to take me, how to tie the knots. He kept saying your name, kept saying you were in the way, that you were too stubborn to sell, that you needed to be taught a lesson. Gideon stood there in the hot Kansas sun, his whole world tilting sideways like a wagon with a broken wheel. Everything he thought he knew, everything he believed about the people around him, all of it crumbling like a sandcastle in a rising tide. One of his own men had done this, had hurt this woman, had left her like bait in a trap meant for him. "Are you sure?" His voice came out rough, strained, like he was choking on the words. May nodded. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I am sure. I will never forget his face. Not as long as I live." Gideon felt the anger rising again. But this time it was different. This time it was mixed with something else, something colder, something harder. Betrayal, the worst kind of pain there is. He started walking again. Faster now, his jaw set hard like granite. "Then I reckon we have got some talking to do, and after that, we have got some justice to find." May held on tight to Copper's mane. Her fingers twisted in the coarse hair. She had no idea that she had just started a war, and neither did Gideon, but they were both about to find out. They had not gone more than 100 yards when the first shot cracked through the air like a whip. Gideon heard it before he felt it, a sharp snap like a dry branch breaking under a heavy boot. Then the dirt beside his left boot exploded in a spray of dust and pebbles, little rocks stinging his leg through the worn leather. Someone was shooting at them. "Get down." The words left his mouth before his brain even finished thinking them. Pure instinct. 20 years of surviving on the frontier taking over. He yanked Copper's reins hard to the left. The horse reared up with a startled whinny, his front hooves pawing at the empty air. May grabbed the saddle horn with both hands and held on for dear life, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. A second shot rang out, this one closer, much closer. The bullet whizzed past Gideon's ear with a sound like an angry hornet. So close he could feel the wind of it passing. So close that if he had been standing an inch to the right, he would be dead right now. He did not waste time trying to see where the shooter was. He did not stand there like a fool waiting for the third shot to find its mark. He just reacted. He grabbed May around the waist with one strong arm, pulled her off the horse in one smooth motion. They hit the ground together in a tangle of blankets and dust and fear. The impact knocked the breath out of both of them. May let out a sharp little squeak of surprise, like a startled rabbit caught in a trap. Then she clamped her mouth shut tight. Smart woman, she knew that making noise would just make them easier targets. "Stay low." Gideon hissed in her ear, low as you can get, flat as a snake on a hot rock. May pressed herself against the earth. Her face was white as fresh snow. Her whole body was trembling worse than before. But she did what he said, flattened herself out, made herself as small a target as possible. "I thought it was over," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the pounding of Gideon's heart. "I thought we were safe." Gideon shook his head grimly. "Not yet, not by a long shot. Whoever left you out there did not just walk away. They have been waiting, watching, making sure their trap worked." A third shot kicked up dirt a few feet to their left, then a fourth. The shooter was finding their range, getting closer with every bullet, walking the shots in like a man adjusting his aim on a target. Gideon peered over the top of a small rise in the ground, squinted against the bright afternoon sun, somewhere up on the ridge, maybe 200 yards away, maybe a little more. He could see a thin wisp of smoke, white against the blue sky, the kind of smoke that comes from a rifle barrel after it fires. Someone was up there, watching, waiting, taking their time, and they had the high ground. Gideon cursed under his breath. In a gunfight, the high ground meant everything. It meant you could see your enemy before they could see you. It meant you could shoot down at them while they had to shoot up. It meant you had all the advantages and they had none. They were in trouble. He grabbed Copper's reins. The horse was dancing nervously, wanting to run, every instinct telling him to flee from the loud noises and the danger. But he was a good horse, a trained horse. He waited for his master's command. "Listen to me," Gideon said quickly, keeping his voice low but urgent. "I am going to send Copper home. When he gets there alone, my men will know something is wrong. They will come looking for me. They always do." May stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. "You are sending away our only way out of here. You are sending away our only chance to escape. Gideon nodded. That horse can outrun any bullet ever made. We cannot. If we try to ride out of here in the open, that shooter will pick us off like tin cans on a fence post. We will be dead before we make it 50 yards. He did not wait for her to argue, did not give her time to think about it and panic even more. He gave Copper a hard slap on the hindquarters. Put all his strength into it. Go home, boy. Go home. Fast as you can. Copper bolted, his powerful legs churning up the dry earth. He ran like the devil himself was chasing him, zigging and zagging across the open ground, moving too fast and too unpredictable for anyone to draw a bead on him. The shooter fired twice more. Quick shots. Desperate shots. But Copper was already 50 yards away and moving like the wind. Within seconds, the horse was just a brown speck in the distance, getting smaller every moment. Good horse, Gideon breathed. Now it was their turn to survive. He grabbed May's hand. Her fingers were cold despite the heat, cold with fear. Now we move. Stay low. Follow me. Do exactly what I do. They crawled through the tall grass, inch by inch, foot by foot, the sun beating down on their backs like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. The dry stalks scratching at their skin, leaving thin red lines on their arms and faces. Gideon led them toward the creek bed. It was lower ground, messier, full of mud and rocks and tangled roots. But it would give them cover, would hide them from the eyes on the ridge. Behind them he could hear boots crunching on gravel. The shooter was coming down from his perch, not in a hurry, not rushing, taking his time. Moving with the confidence of a man who thought he had already won. That worried Gideon more than the bullets had. A man in a hurry makes mistakes, gets sloppy, misses shots he should have made. But a man taking his time, a man who thinks he has all day. That kind of man is dangerous. That kind of man does not miss twice. They slid down the creek bank and splashed into the shallow water. It was cool against their overheated skin, almost refreshing after the brutal punishment of the afternoon sun. Mud squelched between Gideon's boots, water soaked through to his socks. Keep moving, he whispered. Do not stop for anything. May nodded. Her jaw was set tight. Her eyes were focused and hard. Whatever fear she had was locked down somewhere deep inside her, buried under layers of determination and stubborn will. This woman had already survived one nightmare today. She was not about to let another one finish her off. Gideon felt a flash of admiration for her. This woman had been through hell and back, left broken and ashamed in the middle of nowhere, used as bait in a trap she did not understand. And here she was, still fighting, still moving forward, still refusing to give up. That took guts, real guts, the kind you cannot fake. They followed the creek bed for what felt like forever. The water got deeper in some places, shallower in others. Rocks jabbed at their feet through their wet boots. Mud sucked at their ankles like hungry mouths trying to drag them down. Insects buzzed around their heads in thick clouds. Mosquitoes and gnats and flies, drawn by the sweat and the blood and the fear. Gideon swatted at them absently, his attention focused on listening, on watching, on surviving. Every few seconds he would stop and cock his head, listening for footsteps, for the click of a rifle being cocked, for any sound that would tell him how close the danger was. The footsteps were still there, still following, still patient, but they were farther back now. The creek bed was doing its job, hiding their trail, making it harder to track them. Finally, Gideon spotted something up ahead, a small wooden structure half hidden in a stand of cottonwood trees, gray weathered boards blending into the gray weathered bark. His line shack. It was not much to look at. 4 walls made of rough-cut timber that had seen better days. A crooked door that barely hung on its rusted hinges. A roof made of wooden shingles with more than a few gaps where the rain got through. But right now it looked like a palace, like a fortress, like the safest place in the whole wide world. In there, Gideon said, quick now. They scrambled up the creek bank on hands and knees. The mud made it slippery. May fell once, then Gideon caught her arm and hauled her back up. They ran the last 20 yards in a crouching sprint, expecting a bullet in the back at any moment. It never came. Gideon threw open the door and pushed May inside. Then he followed and slammed the door shut behind them. The sound echoed in the small space like thunder. He grabbed a heavy wooden bar that leaned against the wall, dropped it into the iron brackets on either side of the door. It would not stop a determined man forever. Would not hold against a battering ram or a well-placed stick of dynamite, but it would slow someone down. Give them precious seconds to prepare. The inside of the shack was dim and musty. It smelled like old hay and dried sweat and something else. Something that might have been mouse droppings. A single window let in a shaft of dusty sunlight. Motes of dust danced in the beam like tiny golden fireflies. Gideon pressed his back against the wall beside the window, tried to catch his breath, tried to slow his racing heart. May stood in the middle of the small room, still wrapped in that gray blanket, still looking like she had been through a war because she had. They both had. "What is this place?" she asked. "Line shack," Gideon said between breaths. "I use it when I am working the far pastures, when I am too far from the ranch house to make it back before dark. I keep some supplies here. Food, water, a couple spare blankets. Nothing fancy, but it keeps the rain off." He crossed to a wooden chest in the corner. The hinges squeaked when he lifted the lid. Inside were some canned goods, a few candles, a box of matches, and a clean shirt. He pulled out the shirt and tossed it to May. "Put this on. It will fit you better than that blanket. And there is some pants in there too. They will probably be too big, but we can roll up the cuffs, tie a rope around the waist." He turned his back while she changed, kept his eyes on the window, watching for movement outside, watching for shadows that should not be there. "There is someone coming," May said quietly. Her voice was muffled as she pulled the shirt over her head. "I can hear them." Gideon nodded slowly. "I know. I hear them too." He reached for his rifle, an old Winchester model 1873 that had seen better days. The stock was scratched and worn. The barrel was a little pitted from years of use, but it still shot straight and true, had never jammed on him. Not once. "Stay away from the window," he said. "Get behind those crates in the corner. Make yourself small. If shooting starts, you keep your head down and do not move until I tell you it is safe." May finished changing. The shirt hung down past her knees like a dress. The pants were rolled up so many times at the cuffs they looked like fabric donuts around her ankles. She looked ridiculous. But she also looked alive. And right now, that was all that mattered. "Gideon," she said. Her voice was stronger now, steadier. "I need to tell you something before this goes any further." He glanced at her. "What?" Her voice was calm, almost peaceful, like she had made some kind of peace with whatever was about to happen. "The man I saw at your ranch, the one giving the orders to the others, I remember his name now. I heard the other men say it when they thought I was not listening." Gideon felt his heart skip a beat, then another. "Who was it?" May took a deep breath, let it out slow. "They called him Cole." The name hit Gideon like a sledgehammer to the chest. Cole Drayton, his foreman. His right-hand man, the man who had worked beside him for 20 years, who had eaten at his table 3 times a day, slept in his bunkhouse every night, shook his hand every morning like a friend, like family. Cole, the man Gideon had trusted more than anyone else in the world, except maybe his own father. "That is not possible," Gideon said. His voice sounded hollow and far away. Even to his own ears, it sounded wrong, like it belonged to someone else, some stranger standing in his boots. May shook her head sadly. "I know what I saw. I know what I heard. He was the one giving orders. He was the one who decided where to leave me. He was the one who said you needed to be taught a lesson, that you needed to learn what happens to men who do not sell when they are told to sell." Gideon stared at her. His mind was spinning like a weather vane in a tornado, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. Cole had been with him since the very beginning, since before the ranch was even built. They had driven cattle together through dust storms and blizzards, fought off bandits together on moonless nights, buried friends together in shallow graves beside nameless trails. How could Cole be the one behind this? How could the man Gideon trusted most in the world be the one trying to destroy him? May was watching him, her eyes full of sympathy and something else. Understanding, maybe. She knew what betrayal felt like, knew it all too well. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I know this is hard to hear." Gideon shook his head slowly, like he was trying to shake the truth loose, make it fall out of his ears and disappear. Hard does not even begin to describe it. He turned back to the window. His jaw was set now. His eyes were cold and hard like winter ice. Somewhere out there, Cole Drayton was coming. And when he got here, Gideon was going to look him in the eye, ask him why, and then do whatever needed to be done. Even if it broke his heart into 1,000 pieces. The waiting was the worst part. Minutes stretched out like hours. The air in the shack grew thick and hot. Sweat trickled down Gideon's back, down his forehead and into his eyes. He blinked it away, did not dare wipe at it, did not dare take his attention off that window for even a second. May crouched behind the crates in the corner, silent as a church mouse, barely breathing. Her eyes were fixed on the door like she expected it to burst open at any moment. Then footsteps, boot heels on hard-packed dirt, coming closer, getting louder, not hurrying, not rushing, moving with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. More than one set of footsteps. Gideon counted at least 3, maybe 4. Hard to tell exactly with the way sound bounced around out here. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then a voice, calm and familiar as Gideon's own heartbeat. "Gid, come on out. No need for any of this foolishness." It was Cole. Gideon felt his finger tighten on the trigger of his rifle. The wood of the stock was slick with sweat against his palm. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, like a drum beating out a rhythm of fear and anger and disbelief. No need for what, Cole? He called back through the door. His voice was steady, stronger than he felt. No need for you to explain why you left a woman tied up in the sun like an animal. No need for you to tell me why you have been plotting behind my back for God knows how long. A pause from outside, long and heavy, then a soft chuckle, the kind of laugh you give when someone has finally figured out your joke. When the punchline finally lands. "She told you then." Cole's voice was still calm, still friendly, like they were just having a neighborly chat over a fence post. "I figured she might if she got the chance. That is why I wanted to make sure you found her before anyone else did. Wanted to see your face when she told you the truth." Gideon's blood ran cold in his veins. "You wanted me to find her. You planned this whole thing." "Of course I did, Gid." Cole sounded almost amused now. "Do you think I have spent 20 years working on your ranch because I love cows and dust and backbreaking labor? Do you think I stayed all this time because I enjoyed taking orders from a man who got everything handed to him on a silver platter?" The words hit Gideon like punches, one after another, each one landing harder than the last. "I built this ranch with my own 2 hands, Cole. You know that. You were there. You saw how hard I worked." Another laugh from outside. This one harder, uglier, with no warmth in it at all. "You worked hard, sure. I will give you that. But you started with land that your daddy gave you. Started with cattle your daddy bought you. Started with money your daddy left you. I started with nothing, Gid. Nothing but the clothes on my back and a dream that someday I would have something of my own." There was bitterness in Cole's voice now. Years and years of bitterness that had been hidden away, locked up tight, festering in the dark like an infected wound. "Is that what this is about?" Gideon asked. "Jealousy. It is about what is fair." Cole snapped back. The friendliness was gone now, stripped away like paint peeling off an old barn. "It is about taking what should have been mine all along." May shifted behind the crates. Her eyes were wide, watching Gideon, waiting to see what he would do. Gideon kept his voice steady, kept his emotions locked down tight. "Tell me about the railroad, Cole. Tell me what you have been planning." Silence from outside, then the sound of boots shuffling on dirt, men repositioning, getting ready for something. When Cole spoke again, his voice was different, businesslike, cold. "The railroad surveyors came through about a year ago, mapping out routes for a new line through the territory. They needed flat land, needed access to water, needed a straight shot through to the cities back east." He paused. "Your land, Gid. Your ranch is sitting right in the middle of the best route they found. They are willing to pay a fortune for it, more money than you could earn in 10 lifetimes of raising cattle." Gideon's jaw tightened. "So you decided to steal it from me." "Not steal," Cole corrected. "Just convince you to move along. Make life difficult enough that you would decide selling was the smart choice, the easy choice. By hurting innocent women, Gideon's voice was sharp as a knife. By leaving them tied up in the sun to suffer. She was listening where she should not have been listening, Cole said. His voice was flat, no emotion, like he was talking about swatting a fly instead of tormenting a human being. She heard things she was not supposed to hear, so we used her to draw you out. Two birds with one stone. May made a small sound behind Gideon, a sharp intake of breath, like she had been punched in the gut. Gideon felt the anger building inside him, hot and fierce, like a fire burning out of control. 20 years, Cole. 20 years I trusted you, fed you, paid you, treated you like family. And this is how you repay me. Trust is for fools, Gid. Cole's voice was cold as ice, and you were too trusting for your own good, always seeing the best in people, always giving second chances. It made you easy to manipulate, easy to use. There was movement outside. More boots on dirt, the click of rifles being cocked, the sound of men getting ready for violence. Cole spoke again, his voice louder now, carrying through the thin wooden walls of the shack. You have two choices, Gid. You can come out right now, sign over the deed to your ranch nice and legal, and then ride off into the sunset. Start fresh somewhere else, somewhere far away from here. And if I say no, then we do this the hard way. Cole's voice went hard as steel. And nobody wants that, especially not that pretty little thing you have got in there with you. May stiffened at the threat, but she did not make a sound, did not give Cole the satisfaction of hearing her fear. Gideon felt something shift inside him, something hard and cold settling into place. The fear was gone now, burned away by the anger, replaced by something else, something he had not felt in a long time. Resolve. He had built this ranch with his own two hands, had bled for it, sweated for it, given up everything else in his life for it, his youth, his dreams, his chance at a family. This land was all he had, and he was not going to let Cole Drayton take it away. No, the word came out flat, final, like a door slamming shut. No, Cole repeated the word, almost amused. Just like that. No, just like that, Gideon said. You want my land, Cole, you are going to have to bury me on it first, because I am not leaving. Not today, not ever. May looked at him, her eyes were wide. She understood what he was doing, understood that he was drawing a line in the sand, making a stand, even if it cost him everything. Maybe especially if it cost him everything. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he let out a long, slow breath. All right, Gid, have it your way. We do this the hard way. The door shook as something heavy slammed against it. Once. Twice. The wooden bar held, but it would not hold forever. Nothing holds forever. Gideon moved fast. He grabbed May by the arm and pulled her away from the crates, pushed her toward the back wall of the shack. Stay behind me, he said. No matter what happens, stay behind me. May nodded. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fierce. She had survived too much to give up now. Another slam against the door. The wood cracked. Splinters flew. Gideon raised his rifle, aimed at the door. His finger rested on the trigger. Ready. Come on, Cole, he said softly. Let us finish this. The door exploded inward. Two men rushed through the opening. Hired guns, strangers. The kind of men who did dirty work for dirty money and did not ask questions about right or wrong. Gideon fired twice. The first shot caught the lead man in the shoulder, spun him around like a tom, sent him crashing into the wall. The second shot went wide, missed by inches, punched through the wooden wall and disappeared into the bright afternoon outside. The second hired gun raised his pistol. His eyes were cold, empty, the eyes of a man who had killed before and would kill again without losing any sleep over it. Gideon threw himself sideways. The bullet whizzed past his head, so close he felt the wind of it, so close it made his ears ring. He landed hard on the dirt floor. The impact knocked the breath out of him. His rifle flew from his hands, skittered across the floor, out of reach. The hired gun aimed again, his finger tightening on the trigger, a smile spreading across his face. This was it. This was how it ended. Shot down in a line shack in the middle of Kansas, by a stranger who did not even know his name. Then May moved. She grabbed the iron poker from beside the coal stove. swung it with all her strength, hit the hired gun right across the back of his head with a crack that echoed through the small space. The man dropped like a puppet with cut strings. His pistol fell from his fingers. He did not move. May stood there breathing hard, the poker still raised. Her eyes were wild, shocked, like she could not believe what she had just done. Gideon scrambled to his feet, grabbed his rifle, gave May a quick nod. Good hit. I have never hit anyone before. Her voice was shaking, her hands were shaking too, but she did not drop the poker. Gideon turned back toward the door. The first man was still down, groaning, clutching his shoulder. Not a threat anymore. But Cole was still out there, and there were still more men. As if on cue, Cole's voice came from outside. Closer now, just beyond the shattered door. Impressive Gid. I did not think the woman had that kind of fight in her. Maybe I should have hit her harder when I had the chance. May flinched at the words, but she stood her ground, did not back away. Gideon moved to the doorway, pressed his back against the wall beside it, risked a quick glance outside. Cole was standing about 30 feet away, his pistol drawn but not aimed. Behind him were two more men, both armed, both watching the shack with hungry eyes. 4 against 2, and one of the two had never fired a gun in her life. Not great odds. But Gideon had faced worse. Come on out, Gid, Cole called. We can talk about this, work something out. You do not have to die today. Gideon shook his head even though Cole could not see it. Neither do you, Cole. Just turn around, right away, forget this ever happened. I will not come after you. You have my word. Cole laughed. That cold, ugly laugh again. Your word is worthless, Gid. You would hunt me down. I know you. Know how you think. The moment I turn my back, you would put a bullet in it. Is that what you would do, Cole? Gideon asked. Shoot a man in the back. I would do whatever it takes, Cole said. That is the difference between us. You have principles, morals, a code you live by. I have none of those things. I just have hunger. And hunger always wins in the end. Gideon heard something then, something faint, carried on the wind, a sound he knew as well as his own heartbeat. Hoofbeats, distant but getting closer. A lot of them, moving fast across the prairie. Cole heard it too, his head turned, his eyes scanning the horizon. What is that? One of his men asked. Sounds like riders. Gideon felt hope flare in his chest, hot and bright. That is my boys, he said. Copper made it home, and they are coming for me. Cole cursed under his breath. His carefully laid plan was falling apart, crumbling like a sand castle in a rising tide. Spread out, he barked at his remaining men. Do not let anyone get through, but it was too late. The riders came over the rise like an avenging storm. 6 men on horseback, armed and ready, their faces grim, their eyes hard. Leading the charge was old Tom Briggs, 63 years old with a white beard that hung down to his chest. He had worked on the Mercer Ranch since before Gideon took it over, knew every inch of the land, knew every fence post and water hole and hiding spot, and he knew that Cole Drayton had no business being here. Not like this, not with guns drawn and blood in the air. Tom's voice boomed across the prairie like thunder. Cole Drayton, what in the name of all that is holy do you think you are doing? Cole froze. His men froze with him. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Cole did something Gideon did not expect. He smiled. That same friendly smile he had worn for 20 years. The smile he used when he was lying, when he was scheming, when he was pretending to be something he was not. Tom, good to see you. Listen, there has been some trouble here. Gid has gone crazy, started shooting at us for no reason. I think the sun got to him. Gideon stepped out of the shack, his rifle raised, his eyes locked on Cole. Do not listen to him, Tom. Cole is the one who did this. He left that woman tied up by the river, used her as bait to draw me out. Then he and his boys tried to kill us both. Tom's eyes swept over the scene. The bullet holes in the shack, the blood on the ground, Cole and his remaining hired guns. His expression hardened. That true Cole. Cole's smile flickered. The mask was slipping. The friendly neighbor act was not working anymore. Tom, you do not understand. The railroad is coming through. There is money to be made. More money than you can imagine. Gid is just being stubborn. If he would just sign over the deed, we could all be rich. Tom shook his head slowly. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip. I have known you for 20 years, Cole. Branded calves with you. Rode the range with you. Called you friend. He paused. But I have known Gid longer, and I know the difference between a good man and a snake. His pistol cleared leather in one smooth motion, pointed right at Cole's chest. Drop your iron, now, all of you. Cole's men looked at each other, then at the six-armed ranch hands surrounding them, then at the guns pointed at their heads. They dropped their weapons. Cole stood alone, his pistol still in his hand, his face twisted with rage and frustration. This is not over, he snarled. The railroad has money, power. They will send more men, more guns. You cannot fight them forever. Tom cocked his pistol. The click was very loud in the sudden silence. Maybe not, but we can fight you right here, right now, so I am going to ask you one more time, Cole. Drop your iron, or I drop you. Cole stared at him, his eyes full of hate, his jaw tight with fury. Then slowly, very slowly, he let the pistol fall from his fingers. It landed in the dust with a soft thump. Smart choice, Tom said. The ranch hands moved in, grabbed Cole and his men, tied their hands behind their backs with the same kind of rope that had been used on May. Gideon walked over to where Cole stood, looked him in the eye for what felt like the first time. 20 years, Gideon said softly, and I never knew. Cole smiled, but it was a broken smile now, a defeated smile. That is because you never really looked at Gid. You saw what you wanted to see, believed what you wanted to believe, just like everyone else. Maybe, Gideon said, or maybe you were just a better liar than I gave you credit for. He turned away. Could not stand to look at Cole anymore. Could not stand to see what his friend had become. What he had always been. May came out of the shack. She walked slowly, carefully, like someone who had been through a long, hard journey and was finally seeing the end of it. She stopped beside Gideon, looked at Cole, at the men who had hurt her, who had used her, who had left her to suffer. Then she turned to Gideon. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. Is it over? Gideon nodded. It is over. May let out a breath, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry all the fear and pain and shame of the last day out of her body. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She laughed. Not a big laugh, not a loud laugh, just a small, quiet laugh of relief, of release, of being alive when she had been so sure she was going to die. Gideon found himself smiling too. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the bullets and the blood, they had made it, and that was something worth smiling about. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Cole and his men were tied to their horses, their hands bound, their weapons taken. They rode in the middle of the group, surrounded by ranch hands who had known them for years, who had worked beside them, eaten with them, laughed with them. Now they looked at Cole like he was a stranger, because in a way he was. The man they thought they knew had never really existed. He had been a mask, a performance, a lie that lasted 20 years. May rode double with Gideon on one of the spare horses. She sat in front of him, her back against his chest, his arms around her as he held the reins. She was still wearing his old shirt, still pale and tired, but there was color coming back to her cheeks, life coming back to her eyes. You okay? Gideon asked softly. The words were just for her, lost in the sound of hoofbeats and creaking leather. May nodded slowly. I think so. I will be. She turned her head to look at him. Thank you. For everything. For finding me. For saving me. For not giving up even when it would have been easier. Gideon shook his head. You saved yourself. I just helped a little. May smiled, a real smile, the first one he had seen from her. You helped a lot. They rode on in comfortable silence. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and beautiful, the kind of view that made you feel small and big at the same time. Gideon had seen this sunset 1,000 times, had watched it from horseback and from his front porch and from the middle of a cattle drive. It never got old, never stopped being beautiful. But tonight it felt different somehow. Brighter, more alive. Maybe because he had almost lost it, almost lost everything. And now he was riding home with his ranch intact and his life still his own. That kind of close call changes how you see things, makes you appreciate what you have, what you almost lost. They reached the ranch just as the last light was fading from the sky. The main house stood on a small rise. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, built to last through harsh winters and hot summers and anything else the world might throw at it. Gideon's father had built the original cabin back in 1842, just 4 walls and a roof. A place to sleep between long days of breaking wild land and building something from nothing. Gideon had expanded it over the years. Added rooms, added a proper kitchen with a cast iron stove, added a porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house, a place to sit and watch the sunset, to drink coffee in the morning and whiskey at night. Home. The word had never meant so much. Martha Sims came running out to meet them. She was the cook and housekeeper, had been since Gideon's mother passed 15 years ago. A stout woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Lord have mercy," she exclaimed. "When I saw Copper come home alone, I thought the worst. Thought we would find you dead in a ditch somewhere." "I am fine, Martha," Gideon said, "but this woman needs looking after. She has been through a hard time." Martha's eyes went to May, took in the oversized shirt, the bare feet, the bruises on her wrists that were turning purple and black. Her expression softened immediately. The worried frown became something gentler, something maternal. "Oh, you poor thing," she said. "Come with me right now. Let me get you cleaned up, get you some real clothes, some hot food." She helped May down from the horse, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, led her toward the house like a mother hen gathering a lost chick. "There is fresh water heating," Martha said as they walked, "and I have got a spare dress that should fit you better than that old shirt. Are you hungry? When did you last eat a proper meal?" May looked back at Gideon as she was guided away. There was gratitude in her eyes, and something else, something warmer that he could not quite name. "Thank you," she mouthed. Then Martha whisked her inside. Gideon climbed down from the horse. His legs felt like they were made of water. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion. Bone-deep weariness that made his whole body ache. Tom walked over. His weathered face was serious. "Marshal Thompson is on his way," he said. "Sent one of the boys to fetch him soon as we got word there was trouble. Should be here within the hour." Gideon nodded. "Good. Put Cole and his men in the bunkhouse, under guard. Nobody talks to them until the marshal gets here." "What are you going to do?" Gideon looked toward the house, toward the warm light spilling from the windows. "I am going to wash up, get something to eat, and try to figure out how I missed this for 20 years. Tom put a hand on his shoulder, a brief gesture of support. "Some men are just good at hiding what they are. Cole fooled all of us, not just you." Gideon shook his head. "He worked beside me every day. Ate at my table. I should have seen something, some sign, some hint of what he really was." "Maybe," Tom said, "or maybe you just wanted to believe the best in him. That is not a bad thing, Gid. It is what makes you a good man." Gideon looked at his old friend, at the lines on his face, the white in his beard, the years of loyalty and hard work written in every wrinkle. "Thank you, Tom, for coming, for not giving up on me." Tom snorted. "Give up on you? Boy, I have been pulling your bacon out of the fire since you were knee-high to a grasshopper." "You think I was going to stop now?" He turned and walked toward the bunkhouse, barking orders at the other hands, taking charge like he had always done. Gideon watched him go, felt something loosen in his chest, something he had not even realized was tight. He was not alone, had never been alone, even when it felt like the whole world was against him. There were still good people, still friends he could count on. That was worth remembering. He headed inside. The house was warm and bright, smelled like fresh bread and roasting meat. Martha must have been cooking when they left to find him. The meal was still waiting. He washed up at the basin in the kitchen, scrubbed the dirt and blood and sweat from his face and hands, changed into clean clothes, felt almost human again. May came downstairs just as he was sitting down at the table. She was wearing one of Martha's spare dresses, a simple blue cotton thing that fit her better than his old shirt had. Her hair was clean and brushed. Her face was scrubbed. She looked different now, not like the broken woman he had found by the river, more like the woman she had been before all this happened, strong, proud, alive. You clean up nice, Gideon said. May smiled. So do you. I almost did not recognize you without all the dirt. She sat down across from him. Martha brought plates of food, roast beef and potatoes and fresh bread. The kind of simple, hearty meal that tastes like heaven after the kind of day they had. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, too tired and too hungry for conversation. Just the clink of forks on plates and the crackle of the fire in the big stone fireplace. Finally, May spoke. What happens now? Gideon set down his fork, considered the question. Marshal Thompson will be here soon. He will take statements. Arrest Cole and his men. There will be a trial and then justice, whatever that looks like. May nodded slowly. Her eyes were distant, thinking about something. What about the railroad? What Cole said about them having money and power, about sending more men. Gideon shook his head. The railroad does not want trouble. They want a clear route and a clean deal. If Cole was their man and Cole is in prison, they will find another way, another route. They are businessmen. They will take the path of least resistance. And if they do not, then we deal with that when it happens. One problem at a time. May smiled, a tired smile, but a real one. You make it sound simple. It is simple, Gideon said. Not easy, but simple. You just do what is right, one day at a time, one choice at a time, and eventually things work out. Do you really believe that? Gideon thought about it, about all the years he had spent on this land, all the hardships and setbacks and near disasters, all the times he had wanted to give up, pack it in, start over somewhere else. But he never had. He had kept going, kept working, kept believing that tomorrow would be better than today. And it usually was. Yeah, he said, I really believe that. May looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, looking for something. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find it. I wish I could believe that, she said softly. After everything that has happened, I wish I could believe that things work out in the end. You will, Gideon said. Give it time. A knock at the door interrupted them. Martha went to answer it. Marshal Frank Thompson stood on the porch, a big man with a bigger mustache. He had been keeping the peace in this part of Kansas for 15 years, knew every rancher, every outlaw, every grudge and feud that simmered beneath the surface. Gideon, he said, nodding as he stepped inside. Heard you had some trouble today. You could say that. Thompson pulled out a small notebook and pencil. His eyes swept over the room, taking in the details, the half-eaten meal, the woman sitting at the table, the weariness on both their faces. Why do you not start from the beginning? Tell me everything. So Gideon told him about finding May by the river, about the shots from the ridge, about the line shack and the confrontation and Cole's confession. He told him about the railroad and the land deal and the 20 years of friendship that turned out to be nothing but lies. Thompson listened without interrupting, his pencil scratching across the pages of his notebook, taking down every detail. When Gideon finished, the marshal let out a long, slow breath. Cole Drayton, he said, shaking his head. I never would have guessed. He always seemed like such a solid man. He was solid, Gideon said. Solid at lying, solid at pretending, solid at hiding what he really was. Thompson turned to May. I will need to get your statement too, miss, if you are up for it. May nodded, her jaw was set. Her eyes were clear. I am ready, she told her story. From the beginning, the depot in Abini, the meetings she overheard, the men who grabbed her, the hours she spent tied up in the sun, waiting to die. Her voice was steady throughout. She did not cry, did not break down, just laid out the facts one by one, like she was reading from a script. But Gideon could see the pain behind her eyes, the memories that would haunt her for years to come. Some wounds never fully heal. You just learn to live with the scars. Thompson finished writing, closed his notebook. That is enough for now, he said. I will take Cole and his men into custody tonight. We will set a trial date as soon as possible. He looked at Gideon. You know Cole is going to deny everything, claim he is innocent, claim this was all some kind of misunderstanding. Let him, Gideon said. May saw everything, heard everything, and my men saw him and his boys shoot at us. The truth will come out. Thompson nodded. I hope so. The railroad has deep pockets. They might hire some fancy lawyer to get Cole off. Then we make sure everyone knows what he did, Gideon said. His voice was hard. Every rancher in the county, every family in town, even if he walks free from the courtroom, he will never work in this territory again. Thompson stood to leave. Get some rest. Both of you. You have earned it. He put on his hat and walked out into the night. Gideon and May sat alone at the table. The fire crackled. The candles flickered. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass like it was sharing secrets. Are you going to be okay? May asked. Gideon looked at her. At this woman who had stumbled into his life just hours ago, who had turned everything upside down, who had shown him that even after 48 years, there were still surprises waiting around every corner. Yeah, he said, I think I am. He paused. What about you? What are you going to do now? May looked down at her hands, at the bruises on her wrists that were slowly fading. I do not know. I cannot go back to Abene. Cannot go back to that depot. Not after everything that happened. She looked up at him. I do not really have anywhere to go. Gideon felt something stir in his chest. Something he had not felt in a long time. You could stay here, he said. The words came out before he could stop them. At least for a while. Until you figure out what you want to do next. May stared at him, surprised. Stay here. On your ranch. We have plenty of room. And Martha could use the help. She has been complaining about being overworked for years. May was quiet for a long moment, considering. Why would you do that? She asked. You do not know me. You do not owe me anything. Gideon shrugged. Maybe not. But you do not have anywhere else to go, and I happen to have room. Sometimes that is all the reason you need. May smiled, that same soft smile she had given him earlier. All right, she said, I will stay. Gideon felt something settle inside him, something that felt like rightness. Good, he said, that is good. The first week was the hardest. May jumped at every loud noise, woke up screaming from nightmares she could not remember, spent hours sitting on the porch staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what had happened to her, trying to find her way back to who she had been before. Gideon gave her space, let her heal at her own pace, did not push or prod or ask questions she was not ready to answer. He had seen men come back from war, seen the haunted look in their eyes, the way they flinched at sounds that meant nothing, the way they disappeared inside themselves for hours at a time. May was not so different. She was fighting her own war, against memories, against fear, against the shame that still clung to her like a shadow. All Gideon could do was be there, be patient, be kind, and trust that eventually she would find her way through. Martha helped more than anyone. She bustled around the house like a mother hen, making sure May ate 3 meals a day, making sure she slept in a real bed with clean sheets, making sure she knew she was safe. She also put May to work, gave her small tasks at first, shelling peas, folding laundry, setting the table for meals. Then bigger tasks, kneading bread, cleaning the kitchen, helping cook dinner for the ranch hands. The work seemed to help, gave May something to focus on, something to do with her hands, besides twist them together in her lap. By the second week, she was laughing again, small laughs at first, then bigger ones, real ones. She had a good laugh, warm and bright, the kind that made you want to laugh along even if you did not know what was funny. Gideon found himself looking forward to hearing it, found himself making jokes just to see if he could coax a smile out of her, found himself thinking about her more than he probably should. He was not sure what to make of that. He was 48 years old, long past the age when most men started families, long past the age when romance was supposed to find you and sweep you off your feet. He had given up on all that years ago, decided that some men were meant to be alone, that he was one of them. But now here was May, with her dark hair and her tired eyes and her laugh that made him feel like a young man again. It was confusing and a little bit scary, so he pushed the feelings down, buried them deep, focused on the work that needed doing, the cattle that needed tending, the fences that needed mending. There was always work, always something to keep your hands busy and your mind from wandering to places it should not go. The trial of Cole Drayton was set for the 3rd week of August. Gideon and May would both have to testify, tell their stories in front of a judge and jury, look Cole in the eye and describe what he had done. May was nervous about it. Gideon could tell. She got quiet whenever the trial came up, Her eyes went distant. Her hands started shaking. He found her on the porch one evening, sitting in the rocking chair, staring at the sunset. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. May shook her head. He sat down in the chair beside her. "Watch the sky turn from blue to orange to pink." "Beautiful," he said. May nodded. "I never really watched sunsets before," she said. "Before all this, I was always too busy, too worried about the next day. The next problem, the next thing that needed doing." She paused. "Now I watch them every night. It feels important somehow. Like a reminder that some things are still beautiful, still worth seeing." Gideon understood that. The need to hold on to beauty, to remember that the world was not all darkness and pain. "You worried about the trial?" he asked. May was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she looked at him. "I'm afraid I will fall apart. Up there on the witness stand, with everyone watching, with Cole looking at me. I am afraid I will forget everything I need to say." Gideon reached over, took her hand in his. Her fingers were cold despite the warm evening. "You will not fall apart," he said. "You are stronger than you think." "How do you know?" "Because I have seen you, May. Seen what you survived, what you came through. A woman who can endure what you endured can do anything, including standing up in a courtroom and telling the truth." May looked down at their joined hands. "Then up at him? You really believe that?" "I do." She squeezed his fingers, a small gesture, but it meant everything. "Thank you, Gideon, for believing in me when I cannot believe in myself." They sat there until the last light faded from the sky, holding hands, watching the stars come out. Something was changing between them, something neither of them had words for yet, but it was there, growing, taking root, like a seed planted in fertile soil, just waiting for the right moment to bloom. The morning of the trial dawned bright and clear. Gideon dressed in his best clothes, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, the black coat he wore to church and funerals. He even shined his boots. First time in years. May wore the green dress Martha had made for her. Simple but elegant. It brought out the color in her eyes, made her look strong and beautiful and ready for anything. They rode into a bene together. The town was bustling. Word of the trial had spread. People had come from all over the county to see Cole Drayton face justice. The courthouse was packed, every seat taken, people standing along the walls, crowding the doorways. Gideon and May took their seats in the front row. Behind them sat Tom Briggs and the other ranch hands. A show of support, a reminder that they were not alone. The judge was a stern man named Harrison. Gray-haired and sharp-eyed, he had a reputation for fairness, for not letting money or power sway his decisions. The prosecutor was a young man from the territorial capital, ambitious, eager to make a name for himself. He had been preparing for weeks, had dozens of witnesses ready to testify. Cole's defense lawyer was exactly what Marshall Thompson had predicted. A fancy man from back east, expensive suit, smooth voice, the kind of lawyer who charged more for an hour than most men made in a month. Cole himself sat at the defense table. He was clean-shaven, hair slicked back, wearing clothes that made him look like a respectable businessman instead of the monster he was. He caught Gideon's eye across the room, smiled, that same friendly smile he had worn for 20 years. But the smile did not reach his eyes anymore. The mask was broken. Everyone could see the darkness underneath. The trial lasted 3 days. Gideon testified on the first day, told the story from beginning to end. The judge and jury listened in silence, their faces grave. Cole's lawyer tried to trip him up, asked trick questions, tried to make him contradict himself. But Gideon stayed calm, stayed steady, answered every question with simple honesty. He had nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. When he stepped down from the witness stand, he felt lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. May testified on the second day. She was nervous at first. Her voice trembled when she took the oath. Her hands shook when she sat down in the witness chair. But as she told her story, she grew stronger, more confident. The words came easier, the memories less painful. She looked Cole right in the eye when she described what he had done. How his men had grabbed her, how they had tied her up, how they had left her in the sun to suffer and die. Cole tried to stare her down, tried to break her with his gaze. She did not even blink. By the time she finished, there was not a person in that courtroom who doubted her, not a person who did not believe every word. She stepped down from the witness stand with her head held high, walked back to her seat beside Gideon. He took her hand, squeezed it. "You did it," he whispered. She smiled, tears running down her cheeks, but happy tears, relieved tears. "Yes," she said, "I did." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they came back, their faces were hard, set. They had made their decision and they were certain of it. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted. Cheers and shouts, people clapping and hugging. Cole sat frozen at the defense table, his face white, his eyes empty. He had lost. Finally and completely lost. The judge banged his gavel, called for order. "Cole Drayton," he said, his voice booming through the suddenly silent room. "You have been found guilty of assault, of attempted murder, of conspiracy, of fraud." He paused. "I sentence you to 20 years in the territorial prison. May God have mercy on your soul." The bailiffs came forward. "Put Cole in chains. Led him away." As he passed Gideon, their eyes met. "This is not over," Cole said, his voice low, dangerous. "Someday I will get out. And when I do." Gideon cut him off. "When you do, I will be waiting, and I will not be so merciful next time." Cole was led out of the courtroom. Out of Gideon's life. It was over. Really and truly over. Gideon turned to May. She was crying again, but smiling too, laughing through her tears. "We did it," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. "We did." He pulled her into his arms, held her tight, did not care who was watching or what they might think. She was safe now. They both were, and that was all that mattered. And the weeks after the trial were peaceful. May settled into life at the Mercer Ranch like she had always belonged there. She helped Martha in the kitchen every morning, learned to make biscuits and gravy, discovered she had a talent for apple pie that made the ranch hands fight over the last slice. She learned to ride too. Gideon taught her himself, starting with gentle old Copper, who was patient enough to tolerate a beginner's mistakes. At first she was terrified, clutched the saddle horns so tight her knuckles turned white, squeezed her eyes shut every time Copper took a step. But she kept at it, day after day, week after week, getting a little better each time. By the end of the first month, she could trot around the corral without falling off. By the end of the second, she was riding out to the pastures with Gideon, helping check fences, count cattle, do the work of running a ranch. She was a natural, quick to learn, eager to help. The ranch hands accepted her without question. She was one of them now, part of the family. Even Tom Briggs warmed up to her, which was saying something because Tom did not warm up to anyone quickly. "That girl has grit," he told Gideon one evening, shaking his head in admiration. "After everything she went through, she just keeps going, keeps fighting. That takes something special." Gideon nodded. He knew better than anyone how special May was. They spent more time together as the weeks passed, riding out at dawn, watching sunsets on the porch, talking late into the night about everything and nothing. Gideon told her about his childhood, about his father who built the ranch from nothing, about his mother who died when he was 22, about the dreams he had given up on, the life he had resigned himself to living alone. May told him about her past, about the poverty and the hardship, about the men who had hurt her, about the woman she had been trying to become before everything went wrong. They shared their pain, their fears, their hopes for the future, and somewhere along the way they fell in love. It happened slowly, like the sun rising. You do not notice it at first. Then suddenly everything is bright and warm and different. Gideon noticed it on a Tuesday morning. They were riding out to check the north fence. The sky was blue. The grass was green from recent rain. May was laughing at something he said, her hair streaming behind her in the wind, and he realized he did not want to live without her, did not want to go back to the empty house and the silent meals and the long nights alone. He wanted this, wanted her, wanted whatever future they might build together. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt, left him speechless and shaky and absolutely certain. He did not say anything that day. Or the next. He was afraid. afraid she did not feel the same way, afraid he was too old, too rough, too set in his ways. What could he offer her? A worn-out ranch and a worn-out rancher, a life of hard work and early mornings and endless struggle against land and weather. She deserved better, deserved someone younger, someone with a future ahead of them instead of mostly behind. But the feelings would not go away, would not be buried no matter how hard he tried. They kept growing, kept getting stronger, until they were all he could think about. May was the one who finally said something. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset like they did every evening. The sky was on fire, orange and red and purple spreading across the horizon like paint on canvas. "Gideon," May said, her voice soft. "Yeah, can I ask you something, anything?" She turned to look at him. Her eyes were serious, searching. "Do you feel it too?" Gideon's heart stopped, then started again, beating so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Feel what?" "This." She gestured between them. "Whatever this is between us. This connection, this pull." She paused, her voice dropping even lower. "I think about you all the time, dream about you, count the hours until I see you again. And I need to know if I am crazy or if you feel it too." Gideon stared at her, this brave, beautiful woman who had survived so much, who had found the courage to say what he had been too scared to say. He reached out, took her hand, felt her fingers tremble against his. "You are not crazy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I feel it too. Have felt it for weeks now, maybe since the first moment I saw you." May's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, a smile so bright it put the sunset to shame. "Then why did you not say anything?" "Because I am an old fool," Gideon said. "Because I was scared. Because I did not think someone like you could ever want someone like me." May laughed, that wonderful laugh he loved so much. "Someone like you? You mean a good man, a kind man, a man who saved my life and gave me hope when I had none." She squeezed his hand. "Gideon Mercer, I have been in love with you since the moment you threw that blanket over me and promised not to look." The words hit him like a wave, swept away all the fear and doubt and uncertainty. She loved him. She actually loved him. He leaned forward, cupped her face in his rough, calloused hands, looked into her eyes. "I love you too, May. More than I have ever loved anything or anyone." Then he kissed her. It was not a young man's kiss, not wild and desperate and hungry. It was soft and gentle and full of promise, the kind of kiss that says, "I am here. I am not going anywhere. I will love you until the day I die." When they finally pulled apart, May was crying, laughing and crying at the same time. "What do we do now?" she asked. Gideon smiled. "Whatever we want. We have got all the time in the world." They sat there until long after the sun went down, holding hands, making plans, dreaming of the future they would build together. The wedding was 3 weeks later. Nothing fancy, just a simple ceremony in the ranch house parlor. Pastor Williams from the church in town, Tom Briggs his best man, Martha crying happy tears into her handkerchief. May wore a white dress that Martha had spent 2 weeks making. Simple and elegant, it made her look like an angel. Gideon wore his black coat and his shined boots. His hands shook when he took hers. His voice cracked when he said his vows. For better or worse, richer or poorer, sickness and health, till death do us part. Then Pastor Williams pronounced them man and wife, and Gideon kissed his bride. The ranch hands cheered. Martha started serving cake. Someone brought out a fiddle and started playing. They danced in the parlor, Gideon and May, moving together like they had been dancing all their lives. "I love you," May whispered in his ear. "I love you too," Gideon whispered back. It was the happiest day of his life, and hers too. The first year of marriage was hard, not because they did not love each other. They did, more every day. But the land did not care about love. The land cared about rain and sun and whether you had enough hands to bring in the herd before winter. The summer was dry, the driest anyone could remember. The creek ran low, the grass turned brown and brittle. The cattle grew thin no matter how far you drove them looking for forage. Gideon worked from before dawn until after dark, checking wells that were running dry, hauling water from the river in barrels, doing the work of 3 men because he could not afford to hire more. May worked beside him, learned to rope and ride with confidence, learned to mend fences with wire and pliers, learned to doctor sick calves with poultices and prayers. She never complained, never asked for rest, never showed weakness even when her hands were raw and her back was screaming. Some nights they were too tired to even talk, just fell into bed and slept like the dead until the rooster crowed at dawn. But they made it through. When fall came and the rains finally returned, the grass grew green again. The cattle fattened up, the creek filled to the brim. They sold the herd for a good price, enough to pay off debts and put money in the bank, enough to hire new hands for next year, enough to breathe again. That winter, they sat by the fire in the big stone fireplace, listening to the wind howl outside, warm and safe and together. "We did it," May said. "We survived." Gideon nodded. "We did. Together." She leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his in the dim light. "Do you ever regret it, marrying me?" Gideon laughed. "Never, not for a single second." He kissed the top of her head. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, May Mercer. I thank God every day for that morning by the river, even though it started with so much pain, because without that pain, I never would have found you." May was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke again. "Gideon, yes, I have something to tell you." He looked at her. She was smiling. That secret smile she got when she was keeping something good. "What is it?" She took his hand, placed it on her belly. "I'm going to have a baby." Gideon stared at her. For a moment he could not speak, could not think, could not do anything but feel. A baby, their baby, a life they had created together out of love and hope and faith in the future. He felt tears prick his eyes, felt joy so big it could not fit inside his chest. "Are you sure? The doctor confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to wait until tonight to tell you." Gideon pulled her close, held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, because she was. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to be parents." "Yes, I do not know how to be a father. I never had a good example. My own father was gone so much, working, building, always somewhere else." May laughed softly. "You will learn. We will learn together, just like we learned everything else. What if I mess it up? Then we will mess up together and figure it out, just like we always do." Gideon kissed her, long and slow and full of all the love he had in his heart. "I love you, May. I love you too." The baby was born in spring, a little girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. She came into the world screaming and red-faced and absolutely perfect. They named her Sarah, after the woman Gideon had lost so many years ago. The name felt right somehow, like closing a circle, like honoring the past while embracing the future. May held her daughter in her arms and wept with joy. All the pain and fear and shame of that day by the river felt so far away now, like a bad dream that faded more with each passing day. "She is perfect," May whispered. Gideon could only nod. Words were too small for what he felt. This tiny life, this miracle, born from love and hope in a chance meeting by a river. Everything that had happened, all the darkness, all the betrayal, all the moments when it seemed like the world was ending. It had led to this moment, to this room, to this beautiful baby girl looking up at him with eyes that trusted him completely. And it was worth it, every bit of it. Years passed, one flowing into the next like water in a river. Sarah grew from a baby to a toddler to a bright-eyed little girl who followed her father everywhere. She learned to ride before she could read, learned the names of every horse on the ranch before she knew her alphabet. She had her mother's laugh, her father's stubbornness, and a spirit all her own that lit up every room she walked into. May and Gideon had two more children. A boy named Thomas after Tom Briggs, who passed away peacefully in his sleep the winter Sarah turned 5. And another girl named Hope, because that is what she represented. 3 children, 3 miracles, 3 reasons to get up every morning and work until your hands bled and your back ached. The ranch prospered. The railroad eventually came through, not across Mercerland like Cole had schemed, but close enough to help. Now cattle could be shipped to market in days instead of weeks. Gideon expanded the herd, built new barns, hired more hands, turned the Mercer Ranch into one of the biggest operations in the territory. He also built a schoolhouse, a proper one with a bell tower and glass windows and shelves full of books. May taught reading and writing and arithmetic. Martha taught cooking and sewing and the practical skills every frontier child needed to know. The ranch became more than a ranch. It became a community, a place where people looked out for each other, where no one was turned away hungry or homeless or alone. Cole Drayton served his full sentence, 20 years in a cell. Gideon heard he died a year after getting out, alone, forgotten, with nothing and no one to show for all his scheming. Gideon did not mourn him, did not celebrate either, just accepted it as the end of a story that had stopped mattering a long time ago. Sometimes late at night, he still thought about those 20 years of friendship, wondered if any of it had been real, wondered if Cole had ever truly cared about anything except himself. He never found an answer. Maybe there was not one to find. Some questions just stay questions forever. But it did not haunt him anymore, did not keep him up at night or fill him with anger. He had too much to be grateful for, too much to love, too much life left to live. The past was the past, and the future was bright. One evening when the children were grown and the grandchildren were starting to arrive, Gideon and May sat on the porch together, same porch they had sat on all those years ago, same view of the sunset painting the sky, same rocking chairs creaking in the quiet evening air. But everything else was different. They were older now. Gideon's hair was pure white. His face was lined like a map of all the years he had lived. His hands were gnarled from decades of rope and reins and hard work. May had wrinkles around her eyes, silver threads in her dark hair, a softness to her features that came from years of smiling, years of laughing, years of loving. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they had been. A tired rancher who stopped to help a stranger. A broken woman who found the courage to keep going. Two people thrown together by chance, who chose to build something beautiful out of the wreckage. "Do you remember?" May said. Her voice was soft, worn smooth by time like a river stone. "That day by the river." Gideon nodded. "I remember everything, every detail. Like it happened yesterday. I was so scared. I thought my life was over, thought I would never feel safe again. Instead, it was just beginning." May smiled, that same smile she had given him the first time she laughed after he found her. Older now, but no less beautiful. "You saved me." Gideon shook his head. "We saved each other." She reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were thin and weathered now, but still warm, still strong, still the hand of the woman he loved more than life itself. "If I could go back," she said, "I would not change a thing. Neither would I." They sat in silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon, listening to the laughter of grandchildren playing in the yard, the bark of dogs, the low murmur of voices from the bunkhouse. This was what life was supposed to be. Not perfect, not easy, but full, full of love, full of purpose, full of second chances. Gideon had spent 48 years alone before he found May. He had thought that was his destiny, his lot, the hand he had been dealt and would have to play until the end. But fate had other plans. Sometimes the worst day of your life leads to the best. Sometimes the people who hurt you push you toward the people who will heal you. Sometimes you have to lose everything before you can find what really matters. That is the lesson Gideon would tell his grandchildren. Would tell anyone who asked. When you see someone hurting, stop and help, even if it is inconvenient, even if it is dangerous, even if you have 100 reasons to keep riding. Stop and help, because you never know where that moment might lead. When you get knocked down, get back up. Every time. No matter how hard, no matter how hopeless it seems, get back up. The only way you truly lose is if you stay down. When you find love, hold on to it with both hands. Do not let fear or doubt or pride get in the way. Love is rare. Love is precious. Love is worth fighting for. And when the world gets dark, remember that the sun always rises. Tomorrow will come, and it might just be better than today. May leaned her head on his shoulder, let out a contented sigh. "Happy," she murmured. Gideon smiled, put his arm around her, pulled her close. Very happy. And they were, for all the rest of their days. The Mercer Ranch still stands today, out there on the Kansas prairie, where the grass waves in the wind and the sky stretches forever in every direction. The house has been expanded a few more times. New generations adding new rooms, new memories filling old walls. But the porch is still there. The same porch where Gideon and May watched 1,000 sunsets together. And if you sit in one of those old rocking chairs and watch the sun go down, you might just feel them there, still holding hands, still in love, still grateful for the chance meeting that changed everything. Some stories end with death, with tragedy, with loss that never heals. But this one ends with hope, with love, with the simple truth that every person deserves. The truth that Gideon showed May on that terrible day by the river. You are not alone. Someone cares. And no matter how dark things seem right now, there is always a tomorrow. There is always a second chance. There is always home. There's always hope.